Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 402. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Thelonious Monk, Thelonious Alone in San Francisco. It's released in 1959 on Riverside. This is a first-ish mono pressing from 1960. Interestingly, this record came out first on stereo and then on mono, very unusually, but then again, these were kind of wacky times for stereo. There were lots of releases of this record. It's gotten the O.J. Seat treatment at least twice, so it's easy to find on vinyl. In terms of what to expect, well, this is solo piano, but it is in no way background music. Monk, as ever, demands your attention and sustains it all the way through the record. It's one of three solo records he put out in the 1950s. The first of those he recorded in France in 1954. It's called Piano Solo. It was recorded for radio in Paris the same night that he met his future patron, the Baroness Pannonica de Koenigswarter. That particular record has been released with about, by my count, 20 covers. Here is one of them, but you'll find it under probably about as many titles as there are covers as well. And it's very clearly an earlier record, but Monk's mature style is in play at this point. But the more obvious comparison point for this record is a solo piano record he recorded also for Riverside 2.5 years ago, and that's this one, Thelonious himself. I would say this one is probably the best in terms of sound quality of the three efforts, but this last recording here I would say is a little bit edgier and for me just a little bit more interesting. Anyway, I've already reviewed two Monk records from 1957, so I thought I would mix things up and review this exciting and challenging record made just about 65 years ago in San Francisco. Previously, I've discussed Monk's travails in the early 1950s, whether it was public indifference to his recordings, first with Blue Note and then with Prestige, or the arbitrary loss of his cabaret card following his refusal to testify against Bud Powell on drug charges, or his shabby treatment by Prestige Records in the middle part of the decade. But as crummy as the early part of the 1950s were for Monk, the second part of the decade wasn't so bad, particularly because of his association with Riverside Records, who finally let Monk be Monk and made a star out of him as the jazz world finally got hip to his sound. His music was now being recognized not simply as eccentric, but as serious art. Monk also had a very cathartic 6-month engagement at the Five Spot Cafe in New York with John Coltrane, whose owners also helped him get his cabaret card back. And that was an engagement which effectively re-announced both musicians to the jazz world after both men suffered their own particular kind of exile. Sadly, there's very little of that band which was actually recorded because Coltrane was with Prestige Records at the time and Monk wanted nothing to do with Bob Weinstock, the owner of Prestige. When the Five Spot gig ends around Christmas 1957, Coltrane then goes off to rejoin Miles Davis and goes on to great things, as we all know. Monk didn't really get going again right away. He spends a few months without a serious band, but he forms one in the summer of 1958. That group was his old friend from 52nd Street Club days, Roy Haynes on drums, Johnny Griffin on tenor, and Ahmed Abdul Malik on bass. And you can hear that band live on two Riverside records, Thelonious in Action and Misterioso. But that fall was also colored by a beating which Monk took from police when he was traveling with the Baroness in her Bentley to a gig in Baltimore. In fact, he was beaten twice. The incident begins when they arrive at a motel, probably this one on US 13. Monk goes in to ask for a drink of water because he's feeling sick. The staff call the cops to get this black man to move on. The cops arrive, they beat up Monk, and then they let him get back in the car with the Baroness, and the car goes off. Then they pull the car over a little while later, and they pull him out and they beat him up again. The case itself is pretty shocking reading. I've actually put the link to the case in the description below if you're interested. The cops eventually found traces of cannabis, for which the Baroness took the rap, but that conviction was eventually vacated due to the illegal search and the beating. But Monk ends up losing his cabaret card for a second time. So all the way through 1959, Monk was not allowed to play in bars or jazz clubs in New York, anywhere where alcohol was served, but he could play in larger venues. His February 1959 concert at the Town Hall venue in New York with a 10-piece band was a major critical success. He also had a very well-received week at the Apollo in Harlem the following month, and then he goes back there in June, along with Don in Washington, and that month he also makes another great record for Riverside, one of his best, 5 by Monk by 5. But his difficulties in performing in New York in 1959 meant that he needed to find other venues. He plays Newport in July, and then in the fall he and his quartet tour California. That was a quartet with saxophonist Charlie Rouse, and they played the Hollywood Bowl on the very first night of the very first ever Los Angeles Jazz Festival on October 2nd, 1959. Monk's wife Nellie falls ill. She has to go to the hospital in LA and gets left behind because the band has to go up to the Black Hawk in San Francisco for a multi-week engagement. That trip was Monk's first ever visit to San Francisco, and during that engagement at the Black Hawk, he steps out for a couple of days to make this record. This record is made October 21st and 22nd at Fugazi Hall in San Francisco, made without an audience, just in an empty theater. His producer at Riverside, Orrin Keepnews, had been very pleased with Thelonious himself, made 2.5 years before, and there had always been plans to make another solo record, but as it happens, it was just happenstance that Keepnews and Monk found themselves in San Francisco this same week, and so they decided to make this record. Monk and his quartet had just opened at the Black Hawk the previous evening, and then the next day and the following day, during the daytime in the empty Fugazi Theater, Monk records this record. It's an interesting looking venue. It's still there. It's now called Club Fugazi. I've never been, but here are a couple of vintage and more contemporary photos. When you look at the track list for this record, you might observe that Monk is once again revisiting his own material, 4 of the 6 originals having had more than one outing, and one of them, Blue Monk, having been recorded multiple times on different records by Monk. But as ever, Monk never records his music the same way twice. Pacing, feel, emphasis, all of these things can change radically depending on Monk's mood, the setting, and the time in his career when it was recorded. The recording engineer in this state, Rhys Hamill, is an interesting guy. He was a real pioneer of live recordings in clubs, which really hadn't been done much before. And in fact, just 24 hours before they made this record, Hamill and Keepnews had been at the Jazz Workshop, another club in San Francisco, with Cannonball Adderley and Nat Adderley and their quintet making the record which became the Cannonball Adderley Quintet in San Francisco. That record, very unusually for the time, had lots of crowd noise, but it's very well received, and as a consequence, the live kind of club atmosphere record becomes much more of a thing in jazz. Given that that innovation had happened just 24 hours earlier, it's kind of ironic that this record is made in a cavernous, empty theater. Side 1 starts with that often recorded track by Monk, Blue Monk, which has, at the very beginning, I always think this kind of barroom sort of a feel, but that changes in the second set of 12 bars where you've got these hammered chords and these lurching changes in tempo, but also a supremely rhythmic feel all the way through the playing. The next track is another Monk classic, Ruby My Dear. This is a tender rendering, or at least Monk tender, I guess. It's often pointed out how Monk liked to juxtapose pretty delicate elements of a track with more explosive elements, and this track would be Exhibit A in that tendency. Next is Round Lights, a new composition which Monk then named about the peculiar lights in the Fugazi Theater. Monk is in a similarly percussive mood here. He's really jabbing the keyboard, producing these unusual chords, sometimes just of 2 or 3 notes. And Side 1 closes with a couple of standards. First of all, Everything Happens to Me, which is such a lovely melody, and Monk's treatment is very interesting because if ever a melody just wanted to flow, this is one of them, but Monk really won't allow it. And that's followed by You Took the Words Right Out of My Heart, which he makes unabashedly his. Side 2 starts with another new piece, a tremendous track called Blue Hawk, which was a tribute both to Coleman Hawkins but also to the Black Hawk Club where Monk was playing. And if you ever wanted a snapshot of Monk's genius, for me, the first 12 bars of his improvisation in this track is that. That's followed by Panonica, which is a second tribute composition, and it's one of many tributes which Monk paid to his patron, the Baroness. And it's probably the most upbeat track of all the tracks on here, but the keys do still take a hammering. Those tracks are followed by 2 standards, Irving Berlin's Remember, and there's Danger in Your Eyes, Cherie. If I could play piano, here I would reflect wisely on Monk's wild chord progressions, his dissonance, the way he turns what you might call major moments into minor ones. But I don't play piano, so all I can say is wow. I will say that Monk has a lot in common with Glenn Gould, and it's more than just the humming and the jousting with mental illness. The final track is a Monk composition, Resolutions, and I think it's well placed at the end because it has this often repeated 4-note hook, which has a kind of feel of resolution, which just fits. I think I said at the outset that Monk is never background music, and that is absolutely the case. It's gripping stuff, and Monk on his own is probably as fascinating as he ever gets. There are things that Monk does, accelerating and decelerating, moving from the sweet to the atonal, from these jarring staccato chords to swingingly rhythmic music, which are very difficult for a band to replicate. And so here, as on his other solo records, what you really have is the orchestra of his mind. So find yourself an uninterrupted hour or slip on a pair of headphones and enjoy. For me, this is 5 out of 5 stars.